Hello and welcome to the Mythical RC how-to series. This is the first in a series of videos that shows you basically how to restore or upgrade or look after your Nitro RC vehicle. As you can see on the bench today, we've got a Terminator, an XTM Terminator 2. This is my own car, and as you can see, this particular one has been well and truly hammered. It's filthy dirty, it's covered in muck, and it hasn't been run for about 6 months. So today the plan is to take the engine out, give the engine a really good clean, and then put it back in ready for running. The reason for running this procedure on video is really to show you if you've got a car that's just come out of a garage and it hasn't been run for a couple of years or a year or so, the engine can get gunked up. So the purpose of this is to show you how to restore or at least recover the engine and try and get it running again. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the cover off of this particular car, and we're going to take the engine out. Okay, so with the cover off, you can see there the state that this car is really in. It's been well and truly hammered. It is a lovely runner, it's a lovely car, but it's about time it had a really good clean. So what I've already done here, but I would strongly suggest that you did the same, is with the fuel, I've disconnected the fuel from the tank and I've doubled the tank fuel back. So it would have been connected to the exhaust originally, but I've now doubled it back to the tank, so when I turn the car upside down there's no leakage from here, or no leakage through the carburetor. So we're going to take the engine out of this. For this particular car it's a very simple procedure. The first thing I'm going to do, because it's easier to see, is remove the air filter, and that will need a really good clean. So we'll put that to one side for the time being. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to disconnect the throttle linkage, and you can see that's just a little ball joint which is there. So I'm just going to get a pair of pliers and just lift that off. And you can see this carb is pretty loose, so that's good. And then we're going to take the engine out. Now to do the engine removal on this car, it's fairly simple. It is, I'll just grab a screwdriver. We're going to just, on the end of the exhaust, loosen the screw. As you can see, it's just here, which will then render the exhaust loose. That's what we want. I'm going to pull this exhaust away separately, and we'll take that to one side. We'll give that a clean a little bit later on. Now the next thing to do is to take the engine out. So for this I'm going to turn the car over, and the fuel tank has been doubled back for this reason, so the fuel doesn't leak anywhere with the pipes disconnected. And here I can either remove the engine via the engine mounting screws here and here, or with this particular car it sits on a cradle, which means that I don't have to readjust the engine against the spur gear when it goes back in. So with this particular one I'm going to remove it via the cradle. These screws on some cars can get very stiff, and sometimes they need a little bit of persuasion, either with an impact driver or with a really good fitting Allen key. If ever they're really tight, don't try and undo them with a loose fitting Allen key or an Allen key of the wrong size. And the reason I say that is because, as you can see here, this particular one needs a screwdriver, because I did exactly that, and unfortunately in doing that I stripped the hexagonal head and couldn't get it out, so I had to grind it out. But there we go, that's it. Now the engine is now loose in the frame, so I'll turn it back over again, and there we are. There is our engine out of the car. So I'm going to put the car to one side now, and we'll work just on the engine. And this is the bit that we're going to strip down and basically renovate to bring it back up to normal. Okay, so now it's time to start looking at the restoring of the engine, and for this I'm going to need a couple of tools, and I'll show you exactly what those tools are and why I use them. And the first one is very simple. It's an old flash bottle. I'll move that to one side for the moment. It's an old floor cleaner bottle, which I've literally cut the side out of, and I'm going to use that as a wash tray for the engine parts. And the fluid that we use to wash the engine parts in is old nitro fuel. This looks very yellow. The normal nitro fuel, as you're probably familiar with, is pink. I happen to have some old stuff lying around. If you have some old stuff lying around, it really is the best stuff for washing engines in. Very simply because it's the only stuff really that will dissolve any gunk from previous engines. So if you try to restore an engine that is maybe 3, 4, 5 years old and is truly gunked up inside, then old engine fuel old fuel is actually the best material to loosen it all up again. So here's what we're going to do. So we're going to take off the fuel pipe first of all. I'm going to lose two silicone pipes, and here is the fuel filter. So the fuel filter could probably do with a good clean. So that's the first thing that's going to go into, there we are, that's the first thing that's going to go into my old fuel. That's the first one. Okay, secondly, we're going to take the exhaust off. Now the exhaust is held on, in this particular car, it's held on by a spring, and we're going to pull the spring off and just let it come back off slowly. Even that can go into the cleaner. We get it nice and clean. So put that on there, and then the exhaust will just pop off the back. Now you can see in this case we actually need a new gasket. So in this gasket, in this case, I'm going to lose the gasket because you can see it's torn here and it's starting to leak. And if we start to leak, we start to lose efficiency. But the exhaust can go into the cleaner for sure. And there's a washer which goes over the exhaust. Mustn't lose that because they're very difficult to come by. So the exhaust can go into the cleaner. Okay, now we're onto the actual engine itself. The first thing we're going to do is take the pull start off the back. Here we are, that's the right size one, there we go. And again, just so we don't lose anything and we keep it all together, I'm even going to put the screws from the pull start into the washing fluid. Okay. Sometimes it's quite often the case that pull starts will break, the springs will break, or they need rewinding. I'll show you how to rewind a pull start in a future video. So I'm going to take that off very carefully, and you can see here inside there the spool is actually stuck to the spindle, so if I was to pull it off from there it would just all spring apart. So in this case I'm going to help it a little bit and just prise it back so that it stays together as one piece, because I don't want to get into rewinding the pull start in this case. That's a little plastic gasket I had to make to space this one out slightly, but I'll give that a wash too. This particular engine is a Hyper 7 engine, actually from a Hobeo car or an Offner car, which I had to replace because the original XTM engine was a very good engine, but XTM engines do tend to wear out quite quickly, and it did wear out, so it's now been replaced. So the pull start's off and away, we'll leave that to one side. The next job is going to be the carburetor, and the carburetor on this one is released by releasing, wrong one again, there we go, it's released by releasing the little Allen key in the side there. And I just need to locate an Allen key for that, so bear with me just one moment while I look through my little pot of Allen keys. That just shows we're prepared beforehand, doesn't it? There we go, there we are. So we just loosen the carburetor off, and the carburetor should pull out quite nicely. I'm going to wash the whole carburetor. I'm not going to bother at this point to take it apart. We'll do that again in a future video where we'll actually take the carburetors apart and start to look at them and then refresh how they actually go back together. But that carb is set up and running, and I know it's set correctly, so I'm going to leave it as it is. So now the next job to do is the head, and you can see this is filthy dirty, so it needs a good clean anyway. So the head, and again, just have to put an Allen key down onto the head bolts. So remove the head. In this case it's got 4 head bolts which need to be removed. Again, I'm going to put them into the old fuel so that they can have a good wash. When you put the head back on again, we'll do the restoration and the putting together, there we are, very shortly. But when you put the head back on again, you must make sure that you tighten them very, very loosely each one, and then go around and tighten them up, otherwise the head can go slightly crooked, and if the head goes crooked you'll never get a good seal. One thing to bear in mind though on this head, as with all heads, is there's a head gasket. Head gaskets are very difficult to come by, so be very careful with that. It's a flat piece of metal, mustn't bend it. That again is going into the washing fluid. I'm not going to put the head in the washing fluid at the moment because there's a glow plug in there which I really need to remove. So in here we can see there's the piston and there's the sleeve. So the next job we're going to do is we're going to take the back plate off and we're going to take the back of the engine apart. Oh, this one's tight. You notice I haven't removed the skids and the engine mounting, simply because when the engine goes back together again and goes in the car, it'll just slot straight in and be automatically aligned with the gears. If I was to take the engine mountings off, if I was to take the engine mountings off, then it wouldn't be aligned with the gears and I'd have to do the realignment again. I will show you how to do the realignment. Again, that will be in a future video. And if you happen to be watching this and looking at the comments, if there's anything that you particularly like me to cover in any of the videos, then please leave that in the comments and I'll be more than happy to try and cover that in future videos. I do have experience of many cars and many different types of cars, so again, if there's a particular type of car that you'd like me to cover, if I've got it around, I'll certainly be happy to help with that. Okay, so there's the back plate. You can see the back plate sealing washer, the orange washer on the back there. We're going to give that whole area a good wash in the old fuel. And on this car, on the Hyper 7 car, there's a little turbo fan that sits in the back here, but it also interfaces with the piston and the piston and the crankshaft. There's a one-way bearing in there, which is used for starting. That again is going to go into the washing. Okay, and then finally on the top here is the piston. As you can see there, you can see it. Hopefully you can see it on the video. I'll try and get a bit closer. You can see the piston going up and down within the crankcase. Okay, so we're going to try and push the piston and out of the engine in this case. Now it's quite possible that the crankcase, the sleeve will be stuck in the crankcase. I have seen that happen quite often, and if that happens, then the best thing to do to try and avoid any damage to the piston sleeve, the best thing to do is to take a blowtorch out, and you use a blowtorch simply to push the piston sleeve up. In this case it's quite stuck, and I may need to resort to a blowtorch. But before I do that, let me just see if I can lift that off there first of all. There we are. So in this case, the piston sleeve simply pushed out of the cylinder. If that doesn't happen for any reason, then you need to resort to a blowtorch and warm this area up. Not the sleeve. If you warm the cylinder head up, then the head will expand, move out slightly, and allow the sleeve to become loose. It doesn't always work, but in most cases it does. Whatever happens, if you use a screwdriver inside here and start prising in here to bring the sleeve up, be very, very careful, because any damage at all to the bottom of the sleeve here will render the engine very difficult to start and pretty useless. And if you do damage this in any way, then the best thing to do is get a set of needle files and file down any burrs that you make. But that again is going into the wash pot. And then finally, now that the sleeve is out of place, what we should find is when we put the crankshaft up to the top, we can just get a thin pair of pliers, and we should just be able to lift. I'll try and show you that there without getting my fingers in the way. We should be able to just lift the conrod off, and the piston will fall forward. Okay, now the piston has a direction. If you look very carefully, there's a tiny hole in the bottom, the big end if you like, of the piston, and that tiny hole needs to face forward to the engine. And the reason for that is because as the fuel comes into the front of the engine and through the crankshaft, it then hits that first and makes sure that this bearing is lubricated. If you were to put it in backwards, the big end wouldn't get lubrication and the engine wouldn't last very long. So that's going to go into the washing pot as well, and that's pretty much it. If we want to take the crankshaft out, in this case I don't need to because it's running freely. If we want to take the crankshaft out, from this point it's very simple. It's literally a matter of taking the bell housing off and the clutch out, which we'll do later on in a separate video. But once that's done, the flywheel just pops off and then the crankshaft just pushes backwards and comes out of the back here. You only really need to do that if you're going to start changing crankshaft bearings, etc. In this case I don't need to, but I am going to give the engine a good wash. I'll do it in a separate pot because there's not room in my pot here, but I'll give it a good wash in old fuel, and then we'll start the reassembly process. So thank you for watching that so far. I hope that's made a lot of sense to you. We'll make sure that these are washed now with an old toothbrush. So we give everything a really good wash, get it all nice and clean again, and we'll come back very shortly with clean parts for the reassembly. So now it comes time to reassemble the engine and put it back together. That's basically reassembly. Okay, just to finish off the last section, once I washed it in the fuel, I then took it into the kitchen. I gave it a rinse down in a little bit of fairy liquid soapy water, and then dried everything off, let some of the parts naturally dry, and now we're back ready for reassembly. One good thing about using old nitro fuel as a cleaner is that when you come to wash it, it emulsifies in water, which means that it's very easy to wash away. It's not terribly greasy, so that keeps it nice and simple. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the plug back in the head. I took the plug out previously for cleaning the head. We're just going to put that back in now. So the plug is going to go into my spanner, and mustn't forget the copper washer on the plug, which is the sealing washer. That makes sure there's a good seal between the plug and the head. So we're going to put that back in here. You could of course do this last, but I actually find this much easier to do when the head's out the car. Okay, so the plug's in place, ready to go. On top of that, we're now going to put the can't pick it up, my finger's slightly wet. We're going to put the head gasket, and that goes around the collar of the head. So that's now ready to go back onto the engine, which we'll do in just a moment. First things first though, we need to put the piston and the cylinder back into, or piston and sleeve back into the engine. Now because I've washed this out, it's still slightly damp, so I'm going to use a little bit of spray oil, and in this case it's going to be the 3-in-1 oil, which I'm going to use just a little tiny squirt, just to lubricate where we actually had the engine out, and the reason for that is that that displaces any water that's in there and just makes it much easier to work with. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is put the piston in. Now if you remember in the first sequence of the video, when we put the piston back in place, the hole in the bottom of the conrod, at the bottom of the big end, must be facing forwards. So I'm going to turn this over so that it's facing forwards and slide this into position. Now with this particular engine, I don't know if you can see that, with this particular engine, it only goes in when the crankshaft is at the top. There we are, and that's the piston in place. Now in order to stop the piston from falling out now, we now need to put the sleeve in place on top, okay? And that takes a little bit of a wiggle to put in place. But just a note, and let me put the engine down for a moment, just a note, there's a tiny notch on the sleeve, as you can see it there. Get a bit closer for you. There's a tiny notch on the sleeve just there, which then has to interface with a pin on the engine, and the pin is on the back of the engine there. So we're going to put the sleeve in place, and as I said, it just takes a little bit of a wiggle because of, in fact, let me give it a quick squirt of lubricant. That's it, so that the sleeve slips in quite nicely. There we go. Okay, it's gone over the piston quite nicely, and then spin it around into position so that the notch is in place, and then just push it home. Click. I believe that's home. And there we are, piston's going up and down quite nicely. On a new engine, if you replace the piston and sleeve on a new engine, this will be very tight, and if actually what will happen is that the sleeve will push up. The more worn the engine gets, the less the fit around the top here, which is where it compresses. The sleeve has a very, very slight taper to it, so that as the piston rises up through the sleeve, so the fit gets harder and harder, and that's what gives the engine its compression. This engine is getting a little bit old because it's a little bit loose, but it's still a good engine, and it's still got a bit of life left in it yet, so we've got plenty of time. So having done that, I'm now going to put the head in place in this engine. Okay, the head, it doesn't actually matter which way around the head goes in terms of where it sits, but as you can see, it slots into place, and we just have to position it in such a way that the bolts line up. Now in this case, there we are, in this case all I need is my hex driver, and we'll put the bolts back into place. As I said to you previously, we're just going to very, 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 very loosely fit the bolt, so it's just going to go down, and then when it tightens, just turn it off by half a turn. And the reason for doing that is to make sure that we get the head absolutely square. If I don't get the head square, then it'll cause me problems with the engine later on, and I can't have that. So once again, back off, and 3, there we are, and once again back off, and 4. Oops, I missed that one. Let's try that one again. There we are, in place. And there we are, 4. So there we are. Now all 4 bolts are in place. I can go 1, half a turn to the other side, 2, half a turn to the third one, 3, half a turn, and then 4, half a turn. And now they're all tightened. Now I can give them a good tight, and they do need to be quite tight, these ones, only because this is what seals the compression into the engine. But if we didn't do that, slight tightening sequence, we would have caused ourselves problems later on, and possibly got a warped head, and a warped head does nobody any good. There we go. Okay, so that's all 4 screws in place, and there we are. You can see we've got the compression back. Okay, so having done that, we now need to put our back plate in place. So for this, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to line the piston up with the bottom of the cylinder, as you can see there, only to make it easy to fit. And this, in this case, the little turbo fan has a pin on it just there, which needs to interface with the piston. So I'm just going to make sure that goes into place there. Not very easy to do sometimes. In fact, I'm going to use a pair of pliers to do that with, because it just makes it a bit easier to manipulate. So there we go. There we are. And that's in place. So that's the turbo fan in place with the one-way bearing. Those one-way bearings can be replaced, by the way. You don't have to buy the entire turbo fan. You can get them on eBay or from any good bearing suppliers, and they literally just push out and you push a new one in. If you push a new one in, just make sure you put it in the right way round, otherwise you'll be turning the engine the wrong way round. Okay, and there we are. Finally, the back plate, which fits on top of that. One thing to check on the back plate is just to make sure that the sealing washer is intact, and in this case it is, so it's nice and easy. Back plate in place, there we go, and then we'll put our screws into the back plate. There we are, 1, 2, again, these are just going in loosely, just to start with, so we can then tighten them up afterwards as a whole. You'll notice also on the desktop here, I've got 2 exhaust gaskets. One is the old orange gasket, which is slightly torn, and the black one is a new gasket to replace the orange one. So I just thought I'd put them side by side so that you can see new versus old. Right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's that done. So the new exhaust gasket just fits into place, pops over there like that, ready to take the exhaust, which we'll do in just a moment. First of all though, it's time to put the carb back in. So the carb's ready to go back in. Now, one thing to remember when we put the carb in is, again, just like on the back plate, there's a sealing washer, and I don't know whether you can see it there, but there it is. If that washer is not in place, in this case it's an O-ring, but if that's not in place, then there could be leakage through the carb, and that will cause you problems when idling the engine or even when trying to start the engine. These particular engines have 2 O-rings. They have one around the top joint and one around the bottom of the sleeve just here. But I'm going to put this back in here. Okay, make sure there's a good tight fit, make sure the carb is nice and square with the body, and then we'll tighten up the retaining bolt for the carb. Okay, that's nice and done. Just make sure, yep, it's good and tight, so it's not going anywhere. Carb operation is good. One thing I'm going to do very quickly, having cleaned the carb, I'm just going to put a piece of old pipe on here and I'm going to blow through it. Just to make sure that there's no water in the pipe and the airflow is good, and that's absolutely fine. So there we go, we're all ready to go. Okay, so from there, one more thing to do is to put the back plate on, to put the starter, pull starter on, and we're pretty much ready to go apart from the exhaust. So I'm just going to do that very quickly. Put the starter on, so put a washer in place. Sometimes this takes a bit of jiggling just to line up with the plate, the turbo fan, but in this case, no, we're absolutely fine. It's not fitting in place for some reason, which I just need to check. So let's try and find out where that is. I know where that is, because I put a washer back on, which probably shouldn't belong there. So I'm going to take the washer off now. When I was cleaning just now, I found a washer, which I thought belonged on the pull start, but actually it probably didn't. So let's take that washer out. Bear with me. Here it is. That may have been from an old car that I've restored otherwise, and it was still swimming in the tank. In which case, I mean, somewhere I've got a car. There we are. That's better. That fits now. In which case, somewhere I've got a car that is missing a washer, but it doesn't seem to be minding too much. So Neither am I. Okay, so let's put the back plate in place. The pull side in place. There's one. Make sure the holes are lined up. There we are, one. Again, do it nice and loosely. I'll go to the opposite side now to make sure that the gasket's lined up. 2. Come on, gasket holes, where are you? You lined up there? Not quite. There we are, it's in place. 2. Now, having just put 2 in, I'm just going to do a quick check just to make sure that it turns over and it springs back. I think it's pretty good. The starter, there we are, it's sprung back in now. The starter's a bit tight. I know the reason for that. There's a little tiny piece of starter string where I rewound it, which I probably should have cut off, and I didn't cut off. Therefore, it's just touching the face slightly, and it just stops it from springing back in sometimes. But that's my own fault, not a fault of the engine. Okay, 3, and last one. 4. Okay, and then with all 4 bolts in place, we'll just do another final check just to make sure the engine turns over correctly. Hold still, here we go. And that's absolutely fine. So, having determined that we couldn't fit the black gasket washer, I've gone into my little toolbox and I found a red one. I believe the black one is probably for a different type of engine. It doesn't fit this engine, so I'll put a red one in place now. There's the original old torn one, as you can see. That's no good. So that one's gone to one side and the red one's gone in its place. So I'm just going to slide that back on, and you can see the difference there. So that must be the issue, is that the original one didn't fit, fitted for a different engine. So I'm going to make sure that the exhaust washer is in place. I can always fit that properly or correctly once this is done, and then the spring goes in place in the middle holes. I always tend to use the middle holes. Don't actually know what the others are for, but I guess it's for different heights of engines. Again, make sure that's in place. This is always very fiddly, and you have to be careful with high tensile springs, because if they do spring, especially with a little hook on the end, you can hook into your finger. You can hook into your finger and actually cause some damage, which isn't very pleasant. I've done it once and I won't be doing it again. So there we are. So make sure the hook is facing the right way. And there we are. So there we are, the spring's in place. I've just got to put the washer in place now. I'll do that with a pair of pliers and not with my fingers. There we are, you heard it click into place, and that's done. So make sure it's pushed into its position here. There we are. And there we are. So the exhaust is ready to go, the engine's ready to go. I'll put the pipe back on here, and that's now ready to be fitted back into the car. And that's the engine restored and ready to run. When we start this engine, I'll do a separate video on how to actually run and start the engine once it's in place, but when we start this engine, all I intend to do is put a little bit of nitro fuel in here to get it started, and I tend to use something called Easy Start, which is available from Halfords, and it's basically it's an ether based product. Just a quick squirt into the carburetor or onto the air filter will get pretty much most engines started, or at least give you an indication as to whether it's going to run or not. Okay, so that's all we're going to do for the time being. I'll put it back into the car once the car's been cleaned, and you'll be able to see it running. But otherwise, thank you.